1976. A small town hides a dark secret. 4 friends vanished without a trace, leaving behind only silence and suspicion. Decades later, new evidence resurfaces. Evidence that was never meant to be found. What really happened in those woods? And why did so many want the truth buried forever? It began in the late autumn of 1976 on the industrial edge of Newark, New Jersey, when freight trains still carried more cash than armored trucks and the rhythm of commerce pulsed along steel tracks that sliced through warehouses and desolate parking lots. It was the kind of setting that, decades later, investigators would describe as a criminal's dream, and a security nightmare disguised as routine, though at the time no one questioned why millions of dollars in bank transfers were entrusted to trains that rolled across the night. The target that November was a mid-evening northbound freight bound for New York, carrying sealed containers loaded with cash, Federal Reserve transfers, commercial deposits, and bundled payrolls, $10 million in total, packaged in reinforced crates stacked inside a guarded car. And yet, despite armed rail police, time schedules, and supposedly foolproof seals, that night it vanished, not the train itself but the money, as if the car had bled out its fortune into thin air. To reconstruct what happened, we have to look at the crew of men who, over the course of nearly a year, planned what investigators would later call the most audacious theft of the decade, an operation that required not only precision but also someone on the inside. At the center was Thomas Brennan, 37 years old, a rail worker with 12 years on the job, a man who outwardly projected the aura of a family man, blue-collar loyal, married with 2 kids, modest house in Elizabeth, and a reputation among colleagues as quiet, dependable, maybe a little withdrawn. But beneath that exterior was a restless dissatisfaction, years of financial strain, gambling debts piled at the dog track, and the sense that he was perpetually one paycheck away from ruin. Tom wasn't a bad guy, his brother would say later in a recorded interview. He just wanted out, and he thought this was his ticket. He wasn't alone. The operation was organized by Anthony "Tony" DeLuca, 42, a small-time mob associate from Hoboken with connections to fencing networks that could move stolen cash through shell companies and overseas accounts. DeLuca was meticulous, charismatic, and deeply paranoid. He understood that to take $10 million from a moving train required not brute force but choreography, and for that he needed Brennan, the insider who knew the schedules, the weak points in security, and the men who looked the other way. Planning began in January 1976 in the backroom of a failing bar near the docks, where DeLuca laid out the blueprint on a stained napkin. The precise times the freight left the Newark depot, the scheduled slowdown near the Kearny switching yard, and the moment when the armed guard's view line was obstructed. They studied routes for months, timing the gaps, noting that between 8:13 and 8:19 p.m. the train slowed to a crawl beneath the Pulaski Skyway, a stretch isolated enough that no pedestrian traffic ever passed. That would be their window. To finance the tools and the bribes, DeLuca leaned on associates, while Brennan smuggled out diagrams of the rail cars, memorized lock mechanisms, and eventually provided duplicate keys, made late at night in his garage with the hum of a grinder masking his nervous breathing. Other men joined: Victor Vince Marino, 35, a former mechanic with a reputation for cracking safes and a violent streak he kept just below the surface; Robert Klein, 29, a Vietnam veteran who handled logistics, maps, and timing with military precision; and a shadowy figure investigators later only identified as the banker, a white-collar contact who would launder the money once it was out. Each man carried motives that were as much about survival as greed, debts, grudges, desperation. But together they forged something more dangerous, a team willing to test the boundaries of what could be stolen. The night of the robbery, November 12, 1976, was cold, wet, the kind of November drizzle that coated the streets in oily reflections. Brennan clocked in at 6 p.m., his shift beginning like any other, and to anyone watching he appeared as routine as always, clipboard in hand, boots damp, nodding to colleagues. What no one saw was the miniature radio transmitter in his locker, a device bought through a pawnshop and tuned to a shortwave channel, waiting to broadcast the moment the cash car was vulnerable. DeLuca and Marino waited in a panel van parked beneath the Skyway, engine idling, hands gloved, eyes on the glowing watch face that ticked toward 8 o'clock. Klein monitored from a rented sedan 2 miles up, signaling through subtle light flashes when the train cleared checkpoints. Everything depended on timing, and the timing was merciless. At 8:14 p.m., as the train slowed to 15 miles per hour under the overpass, Brennan flicked the transmitter once. 2 seconds of static that told DeLuca it was time. The van pulled forward, matching speed with the moving freight, and Marino leapt onto the ladder of the cash car, metal slick under his boots. He clipped a harness, swung the duplicate key, and within 90 seconds had the side door unlocked. Inside, 2 guards sat behind a steel partition, unaware that Marino's silhouette slid against the crates. He cut a chain, attached a pulley system, and lowered the first container into the van below. 3 crates followed, each weighing nearly 600 pounds, until the van sagged on its suspension. In total, $10 million. By 8:18 the van peeled away, blending into traffic. The train rolled on, guards oblivious until the next checkpoint. For investigators, what made the crime chilling was its simplicity. No gunfire, no confrontation, no obvious alarm. Yet when the train arrived in New York at 9:05 p.m. and guards opened the cash car, the crates were gone, chains sliced clean, locks intact. The first report came at 9:17 p.m. when rail security phoned the FBI field office in Manhattan. "We've got a major theft," the officer said flatly, "containers missing, 10 million plus." Within an hour, the site beneath the Pulaski Skyway swarmed with agents, flashlights cutting across wet pavement, measuring skid marks, combing for discarded tools. They found nothing. No fingerprints, no footprints, just the faint smell of motor oil and a cigarette, but that yielded no usable prints. Forensic teams logged it meticulously, but from the start it felt like chasing ghosts. Meanwhile, the van disappeared into a warehouse in Jersey City, where DeLuca oversaw the transfer into 2 waiting trucks. "Keep calm, keep steady," he told the men, though inside his nerves rattled. He knew the FBI would move fast. Brennan returned home after midnight, stomach twisted, wife asleep on the couch, children's toys scattered across the floor. He stared at them, wondering what $10 million might mean for their future, then vomited in the sink. In interviews years later, colleagues recalled subtle shifts. Brennan smoking more, quieter than usual, his eyes darting whenever patrol cars passed. The money was hidden in waterproof drums, trucked to storage facilities under false paperwork, and distributed across multiple states within days. Yet as smooth as the execution seemed, cracks appeared quickly. On November 15, an anonymous tip, never traced, reached Newark PD, mentioning a panel van near the Skyway, a description that matched DeLuca's vehicle. Surveillance began, shadows on his movements, notes about his associates. And within the group itself, paranoia spread. Klein, the veteran, grew suspicious that Marino's temper would expose them. Brennan feared the FBI would uncover the duplicate keys. "We did it clean," DeLuca reassured them, "but stay invisible or we're finished." Still, questions lingered that investigators could not reconcile. How could thieves offload nearly 2 tons of cash in under 4 minutes? How did they know the guards' blind spots? Why was there no trace? This wasn't opportunistic, one FBI memo read. This was surgical. Internal suspicion fell on Brennan, though without evidence they could only watch. The press caught wind by November 20, headlines blaring, $10 million vanishes from train, no witnesses. Television footage showed agents combing rail yards, while anchors called it the crime of the century. For the public it was thrilling, for the Bureau it was humiliating. "Somebody outsmarted us," Agent Harold Whitman admitted years later, "and for weeks we didn't even know how." By December, rumors swirled of mob involvement, of overseas laundering, of guards complicit. None of it was confirmed. What was certain was this: $10 million had evaporated, and the men who took it believed, at least for a moment, that they had beaten the system. What they didn't know was that surveillance tapes from the switching yard captured faint headlights aligning with the train at 8:14. The footage was grainy, but it was enough to start a chain of leads that would, months later, begin to close around them. But that night, November 12, as Brennan lay awake in the dark, listening to his wife's breathing, he thought of the crates, the weight of them, and wondered if the sound of steel chains snapping would echo in his head forever. And somewhere in Jersey City, DeLuca sat with a glass of bourbon, staring at stacks of cash piled taller than he was, whispering to himself, "We did it, we really did it." What none of them realized yet was that the very precision that made the crime possible had left behind a pattern, timings, routes, mechanical signatures, that the FBI was already beginning to decode piece by piece, until the invisible cracks in their perfect heist would widen into fatal mistakes. And it is here, in the aftermath of that impossible theft, that the true story of betrayal, paranoia, and inevitable downfall begins. The investigation into the Newark train heist unfolded with the weight of both urgency and humiliation pressing down on the FBI field office in Manhattan. For in the weeks following November 12, 1976, every headline, every late-night talk show monologue, and every whisper on the street seemed to mock federal agents who had somehow allowed $10 million in cash to vanish from a moving freight car without a single witness. And in those early days the Bureau's strategy was not so much to solve the case as to restore credibility, which meant pressure mounted quickly on every possible lead, no matter how thin. Agents canvassed the area beneath the Pulaski Skyway, knocking on doors of warehouses and trucking companies, questioning night shift workers who might have glimpsed a van or suspicious movement, but most swore the drizzle and darkness masked everything. Still, two separate accounts mentioned a light-colored panel van idling near the tracks between 8 o'clock and 8:30 p.m., a detail that, while vague, aligned too perfectly with the suspected getaway vehicle. Surveillance footage from the switching yard provided their first tangible clue, grainy black and white film from a mounted camera that caught headlights paralleling the train for less than 20 seconds. It was blurred, indistinct, but it gave investigators proof that an external vehicle had matched pace at the exact window of opportunity. From there the Bureau built timelines, matching train speeds, calculating the weight of crates, even conducting field tests where agents in controlled conditions tried to offload steel containers in under 5 minutes. The experiments confirmed that the feat was possible only with specialized tools and inside knowledge of car design. Immediately suspicion shifted inward toward employees, and though the Bureau lacked direct evidence, whispers began circling Thomas Brennan's name. His work record showed he was on duty that night, his access level high enough to know schedules, his financial records modest yet stained with debts, creditors from gambling, delinquent loans, patterns investigators often flagged as vulnerabilities. By December 2, Brennan was under discreet surveillance, agents tailing his commute, noting his stops, combing his phone records for unusual calls. He noticed, too, his wife would later testify that he grew jumpy, pulling curtains shut, muttering about cars that seemed to follow too long. Still, Brennan played the part, clocking in at work, keeping his head down, never flashing sudden wealth, while DeLuca drilled into his men the cardinal rule: no ostentation, no sudden spending, no loose talk. Yet cracks were inevitable. On December 10, Victor Marino bought a new Cadillac in cash at a Hoboken dealership, a move so reckless it sent ripples. The dealer, suspicious but happy to pocket the sale, later recalled the man's nervous hands and wads of $100 bills. The purchase flagged IRS attention and soon, through informal channels, that information slid toward the FBI task force. "We knew then," Agent Whitman later explained in a recorded interview, "that whoever took the money was already making mistakes. Cash leaves trails even when you think it doesn't." Investigators built a profile. At least 4 men, 1 insider, 1 organizer with mob ties, 1 logistics specialist, and someone capable of laundering large sums. They mapped out the possible distribution networks, from junkyards in Jersey to shell companies in Florida. They subpoenaed bank records, combing for sudden deposits just under reporting thresholds. Meanwhile, the press kept the story alive, with the New York Times publishing a feature on December 20 headlined, "The Vanishing Millions. Who Took the Train's Treasure?" The article speculated mob involvement, quoting anonymous law enforcement sources who hinted at inside corruption, further fueling paranoia inside the crew. At night in Brennan's modest home, arguments with his wife grew sharper, her suspicions mounting as cash appeared in envelopes tucked in drawers. "Where is this from, Tom?" she asked one evening in January 1977, her voice low but cutting. He snapped, "Overtime bonuses, you want me to fix this house or not?" But even as he said it, he knew the lie was brittle. DeLuca, sensing the noose tightening, shifted strategy. He ordered portions of the money moved out of state, concealed in shipping containers routed to Miami and then overseas. But that very movement drew attention. A January 5 tip from a dock worker in Port Elizabeth described men loading drums into a truck marked with a fake plumbing company logo, the description later linked to a vehicle tied to Marino. When agents tracked the registration, they found inconsistencies, shell addresses, fictitious signatures. Yet the trail pointed closer to DeLuca's circle. Tension escalated. In mid-January, Klein confronted DeLuca in the warehouse, demanding clarity on how the laundering would work. "We're sitting on fire, Tony," he said, pacing. "The feds are sniffing everywhere and one slip and we're done." DeLuca snapped back. You think I don't know that? You think I didn't plan for this? You keep steady, soldier boy, or you'll bring the heat yourself. Their clash marked the first visible fracture in the crew. Meanwhile, the FBI leveraged new techniques, handwriting analysis on falsified manifests, cross-checking payroll schedules with train movements, even employing early computer systems to compare financial anomalies across multiple banks. They traced Marino's Cadillac purchase, subpoenaed the dealership, and pulled security forms that bore his signature. The noose drew tighter, yet without direct evidence tying them to the Skyway on November 12, the Bureau hesitated. They needed someone to break. That someone emerged by late February when Brennan's gambling debts resurfaced. A bookmaker in Newark, pressured by law enforcement, revealed Brennan had tried to pay off a $12,000 balance in crisp hundreds days after the heist. He said he came into money, the bookmaker recalled, but he looked scared, like he was about to choke on his own breath. This testimony was enough to escalate Brennan from subject to prime suspect. Agents confronted him indirectly, visiting his workplace under the guise of security audits, asking pointed questions about duplicate keys, about who had access to the car's layout. Brennan deflected, but inside he cracked. In March, he began confiding in a childhood friend, whispering fears that they're coming for me and I don't know who to fear more, the feds or Tony. By April, the task force decided to turn the screws. They raided Marino's Hoboken garage, ostensibly on unrelated weapons charges, but discovered $180,000 in bundled cash inside a tool chest. The bills matched serial numbers from Federal Reserve shipments that vanished on November 12. For investigators, it was the smoking gun. For the crew, it was a death sentence. Marino was arrested, charged with possession of stolen currency, and interrogated relentlessly. At first he stonewalled, but days in solitary and the looming threat of decades behind bars softened him. I didn't take the money, he muttered in one session, I was just the driver. But inconsistencies in his story betrayed deeper involvement. He never gave up DeLuca's name, though, leaving investigators to stitch the chain through circumstantial threads. DeLuca, meanwhile, vanished from his known haunts, retreating into safe houses, convinced that Marino had already betrayed him. Klein, furious, argued they should cut losses and disappear individually, but DeLuca insisted the laundering pipeline was still viable. Brennan, caught between loyalty and panic, withdrew further, his health deteriorating, ulcers burning his stomach, sleepless nights leaving him hollow-eyed at work. His wife threatened to leave, packing a bag once before he begged her to stay. By May 1977, the FBI built a case strong enough for indictments. Brennan for conspiracy, Marino for theft, Klein for aiding and abetting, and DeLuca as the suspected mastermind. But as agents prepared coordinated arrests, DeLuca slipped through surveillance, driving south under a false identity. The manhunt expanded, posters plastered across bus stations, his face broadcast on television. We will find him, an FBI spokesperson declared at a June press conference. It's only a matter of time. But time played tricks. Months stretched, leads went cold, and still DeLuca remained out of reach. For the public, fascination with the vanishing millions dulled into myth, yet inside the Bureau the case burned, unresolved. One nagging question haunted agents. Where was the bulk of the money? Of the 10 million, less than 300,000 had surfaced. The rest was gone, hidden in places only DeLuca and perhaps the mysterious banker knew. Years later, declassified memos revealed suspicions that portions were funneled through offshore accounts in Panama, shielded by corporate veils too thick for 1970s investigative tools to penetrate. But in the moment, all that mattered was catching the men. By autumn 1977, Brennan finally broke. Cornered with mounting evidence and promised leniency if he cooperated, he agreed to talk. His confession spilled over hours. How DeLuca approached him, how he duplicated keys in his garage, how the radio transmitter signaled the van. He trembled as he recounted lowering crates, the sound of chains snapping, the weight of guilt pressing heavier than the cash itself. I thought it would fix everything, he whispered to agents, but it only ruined me. His testimony provided prosecutors with the narrative they needed, yet even as indictments solidified, DeLuca's absence loomed like a shadow. The trial would come, the headlines would roar again, but the question of who truly controlled the missing millions, and how deep the network extended, remained unanswered. And as winter set in once more, The Bureau confronted the chilling possibility that the heist was not just a story of a few desperate men, but of a larger machinery, one that reached far beyond Newark's industrial edges, into boardrooms and offshore vaults where justice could never fully penetrate. Detective Harris had not expected the resistance to be so sharp or so immediate, but when he presented the findings about the land transfers and the suppressed testimonies, his superior leaned back in his chair with a sigh that seemed rehearsed and told him to tread carefully, because these were matters that had been put to rest decades ago, and stirring them up would only bring trouble, not answers. Yet Harris knew from the tightening in the older man's jaw that he was striking a nerve, and that confirmation alone drove him forward into the heart of the records office, where dust clung to every binder and the smell of mildew clung to every page, and he found in the margins of an agricultural ledger a signature he recognized from one of the missing men, as though that man had been keeping private notes inside official books, and beside one entry the word "co-op" was circled 3 times in a shaky hand, suggesting desperation or urgency, and Harris realized that the cooperative itself, which had for so long been celebrated as the backbone of local farming, might also have been a nest of corruption where dissenting voices were silenced not by debate but by disappearance. And as he pieced this together, he felt the loneliness of truth pressing down on him, because no one in the town wanted to remember that side of history. And when he visited Margaret again, she broke down for the first time since he met her, confessing that she had once found a scrap of cloth in the barn with a blood stain on it, and that she had hidden it for years in fear, but eventually burned it in her stove one cold winter night when she could no longer bear the burden of evidence in her home. And Harris sat with her, listening as she described the way silence ate away at her family, how her son grew up suspicious of every authority figure, and how neighbors quietly distanced themselves as though grief itself were contagious. And Harris drove away from her house, feeling the full weight of the past pushing against him, yet still he pressed on, visiting the overgrown remains of a farm that had been at the center of the transfers, and there beneath rotting beams he found initials carved into wood, initials belonging to 2 of the missing, and it was then he understood that they had tried to leave their mark behind in the only way they could while facing forces greater than themselves. And as he stood there, he thought he heard the faint echo of footsteps behind him, but when he turned the field was empty, only the long grass swaying in the wind. Yet he knew he was being watched not by ghosts but by the living descendants of those who had inherited wealth, power and fear. And when he returned to town that evening, he found a note slipped under his motel door with no signature, only the words, "Stop or you'll end up like them," scrawled in uneven ink. And though the threat was crude, it was real enough to quicken his heartbeat and sharpen his resolve, for he now realized that this investigation was not just about the past but about the present grip of power that still lingered like a shadow over every street, every farm and every family. And he vowed silently that no matter the cost he would not let silence win again. Harris stared at the note for a long time, the uneven letters burned into his mind like a warning carved into stone, but instead of fear it left him with a stronger sense of defiance, because he knew now that whoever had gone to the trouble of delivering this threat was connected to the same network that had swallowed the missing in 1976. A network that had not only survived but adapted over decades, its roots sinking deeper into the soil of the town's institutions. And as he drove through the quiet streets the next morning, he noticed subtle details he had overlooked before, like the way the local diner fell silent when he walked in, or the way 2 men in worn baseball caps sitting by the window followed his movements with eyes that lingered too long. And he realized the town was not simply indifferent to his presence, it was wary, tense, as if his digging had unsettled an unspoken pact that held everything together. And when he sat across from the county clerk later that day to request older property records, the man hesitated just long enough for Harris to see fear flicker across his face before sliding a box of yellowed files across the desk, whispering that he should look quickly and not tell anyone where he had gotten them, which only confirmed what Harris already suspected, that truth here was a dangerous currency exchanged in shadows. And as he sifted through the brittle papers, he found a series of sales dated just weeks after the disappearances, transactions made under company names that had since dissolved but whose paper trails led back to the same small circle of influential families, names still etched on street signs and community plaques. And in that moment Harris understood that the vanished were not random victims but obstacles removed with precision so land, money and power could be consolidated without resistance. Yet as he began to draft his notes late that night in his motel room, he heard a sound outside, the crunch of gravel under slow footsteps, and when he looked through the blinds he caught sight of a truck idling under the streetlight, its engine running but its driver hidden in shadow, watching, waiting, until finally the vehicle pulled away, leaving Harris with the unmistakable realization that the circle was closing in, that he had crossed from research into confrontation, And still he pressed on because the deeper he went the clearer it became that silence was the true weapon here, silence enforced by intimidation, by whispered warnings on porches, by notes slipped under doors, by unmarked graves somewhere out in the farmland, and he could not allow that silence to win, not after Margaret's tears, not after the initials he found carved into rotten beams, not after decades of fear that had shaped generations, so he began contacting descendants of the missing, people who had grown up with unanswered questions and inherited grief, and some refused to speak, too wary of stirring old ghosts, but a few shared fragments, like how their fathers or uncles had complained in hushed tones about being pressured to sell land or about strange meetings at the cooperative's office. And when Harris pieced these fragments together, he saw the outline of a conspiracy that was less about a single violent night and more about an ongoing system of control, where those who resisted were erased and those who complied thrived. And though he knew exposing it would not be easy, he also knew that the cost of doing nothing was worse, for silence had already claimed too many. And as he drove once more into the countryside following a lead that suggested an abandoned grain storage site might hold traces of the missing, he felt the weight of unseen eyes upon him, heavy and unrelenting, and he whispered to himself that if this was where the truth had been buried, then he would unearth it, even if it meant becoming the next name no one dared to speak aloud. Harris stared at the note for a long time. The uneven letters burned into his mind like a warning carved into stone, but instead of fear it left him with a stronger sense of defiance, because he knew now that whoever had gone to the trouble of delivering this threat was connected to the same network that had swallowed the missing in 1976, a network that had not only survived but adapted over decades, its roots sinking deeper into the soil of the town's institutions. And as he drove through the quiet streets the next morning, he noticed subtle details he had overlooked before, like the way the local diner fell silent when he walked in, or the way two men in worn baseball caps sitting by the window followed his movements with eyes that lingered too long, and he realized the town was not simply indifferent to his presence, it was wary, tense, as if his digging had unsettled an unspoken pact that held everything together. And when he sat across from the county clerk later that day to request older property records, the man hesitated just long enough for Harris to see fear flicker across his face before sliding a box of yellowed files across the desk, whispering that he should look quickly and not tell anyone where he had gotten them, which only confirmed what Harris already suspected, that truth here was a dangerous currency exchanged in shadows. And as he sifted through the brittle papers, he found a series of sales dated just weeks after the disappearances, transactions made under company names that had since dissolved but whose paper trails led back to the same small circle of influential families, names still etched on street signs and community plaques. And in that moment Harris understood that the vanished were not random victims but obstacles removed with precision so land, money, and power could be consolidated without resistance. Yet as he began to draft his notes late that night in his motel room, he heard a sound outside, the crunch of gravel under slow footsteps, and when he looked through the blinds he caught sight of a truck idling under the streetlight, its engine running but its driver hidden in shadow, watching, waiting, until finally the vehicle pulled away, leaving Harris with the unmistakable realization that the circle was closing in, that he had crossed from research into confrontation. And still he pressed on because the deeper he went the clearer it became that silence was the true weapon here, silence enforced by intimidation, by whispered warnings on porches, by notes slipped under doors, by unmarked graves somewhere out in the farmland, and he could not allow that silence to win, not after Margaret's tears, not after the initials he found carved into rotten beams, not after decades of fear that had shaped generations, so he began contacting descendants of the missing, people who had grown up with unanswered questions and inherited grief, and some refused to speak, too wary of stirring old ghosts, but a few shared fragments, like how their fathers or uncles had complained in hushed tones about being pressured to sell land or about strange meetings at the cooperative's office. And when Harris pieced these fragments together, he saw the outline of a conspiracy that was less about a single violent night and more about an ongoing system of control, where those who resisted were erased and those who complied thrived. And though he knew exposing it would not be easy, he also knew that the cost of doing nothing was worse, for silence had already claimed too many. And as he drove once more into the countryside following a lead that suggested an abandoned grain storage site might hold traces of the missing, he felt the weight of unseen eyes upon him, heavy and unrelenting, and he whispered to himself that if this was where the truth had been buried, then he would unearth it, even if it meant becoming the next name no one dared to speak aloud. The road to the old grain storage site stretched like a scar through the farmland, narrow and half swallowed by weeds, the kind of road that only locals remembered and most had learned to avoid, and as Harris drove he felt the pressure of history pressing in on him, the knowledge that decades of silence had been cultivated here just as meticulously as the crops. But unlike the crops, the silence had never died, it had only thickened, and when he reached the warehouse he killed the engine and sat still for several minutes, listening, the only sounds the distant hum of cicadas and the restless wind rattling against the warped tin walls of the structure. And in that stillness he felt the gravity of what he was about to do, because this was no longer research but confrontation with the very soil that held secrets. And stepping out into the gravel he noticed how the building sagged against the horizon, abandoned in appearance yet strangely intact, its locks new enough to suggest someone still cared to keep intruders out. And when he circled the perimeter he found a rear service door with its hinges rusted but its padlock polished, a contrast too sharp to ignore. So he retrieved the small pry bar he carried for field work, his hands trembling more from anticipation than fear, and after several minutes of prying he forced the lock loose, the metal groan of the door slicing through the countryside like a scream, and inside he was met not with dust and emptiness but with order. Rows of crates stacked with unnatural precision, each stenciled with dates and codes that seemed too recent for a place that was supposed to have been abandoned since the 1980s, and as he stepped deeper, the beam of his flashlight fell on something that froze him in place. Ledger books, neat and bound, lined on a metal shelf against the wall, their spines labeled with years that stretched back before the disappearances, and his breath caught as he opened one at random and saw page after page of names, land parcels, transfer amounts, initials scribbled in margins like signatures unmeant for daylight, and among them were the surnames he recognized from his research, names of the vanished, marked with notes like resolved, completed, or transferred, bureaucratic language disguising the end of lives. And in that moment Harris understood with bone-deep certainty that this site was not just a dumping ground but a ledger, a place where erasures were documented and justified, the cold logic of conspiracy preserved in ink, and his mind raced with the implications, with the possibility that he now held in his hands the proof generations had needed. But before he could think further the sound of tires crunching gravel outside snapped him back into the present. The noise steady, deliberate, and Harris quickly doused his light, crouching behind a stack of crates as headlights spilled faintly through cracks in the siding, and then he heard voices, low but clear, men speaking in tones of routine rather than panic, as if they were here to check on something they did regularly, and the realization chilled him because the conspiracy was not a relic, it was alive, maintained, operational, and when the footsteps drew closer he held his breath, the scrape of boots echoing unervingly close, until finally he heard the metallic scrape of the door shutting again and the hum of the vehicle fading into the distance, leaving him in suffocating darkness but with a renewed determination, because now he knew this was not just about history, this was about the present, about crimes still ongoing, and as he slipped out into the night, carrying one of the ledgers pressed tight to his chest under his jacket, he understood he had crossed a threshold that could not be reversed, for possession of this book was both a weapon and a death sentence. And the next days unfolded in a haze of tension as Harris copied pages, photographed evidence, and traced patterns that pointed to a central figure, a man whose family name had surfaced repeatedly, a man still alive and still powerful in the town, seated on boards, donating to churches, presenting himself as a benefactor while in reality orchestrating the silent removal of anyone who resisted his influence. And the thought gnawed at Harris that exposing such a man would not only bring the weight of truth but also retaliation, the kind that could stretch across counties and decades. Yet the more he investigated, the clearer the human cost became, not only the vanished of 1976 but others in later years, disappearances written off as accidents, suicides, or runaways, each with quiet notes in the ledgers, each a life extinguished in service of preserving the network. And when Harris met with Margaret again to show her photocopies of the pages, her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped them, her eyes wide with the confirmation she had both longed for and dreaded, whispering that now they had to act. Before the book was taken back, before the silence claimed another generation, and though Harris agreed, deep down he knew that bringing the truth forward would require allies, protection, and above all courage, because the eyes in the diner, the trucks parked on lonely roads, the clerk's trembling hands, all were signs that the town would not surrender easily, that it would fight to preserve the silence. And as Harris lay awake that night in the motel staring at the ceiling, the ledger open beside him, he heard once again the crunch of tires outside, closer this time, lingering, and he knew in his bones that the men who had kept these secrets alive for nearly half a century were now aware that someone held their ledger, and that someone was him. The night stretched heavy over the motel as Harris lay fully clothed on the bed, staring at the ceiling with the ledger on the nightstand, its presence a weight that seemed to bend the air around it, because he knew what it contained was enough to shatter lives, topple reputations, and finally give names back to the missing, but he also knew that the headlights that had slowed outside, the hum of idling engines, the anonymous notes, all of it meant the ledger was now a target, and so was he, and in the early hours of dawn he packed his belongings with mechanical efficiency, slipping the book into a messenger bag and driving not toward the county offices as logic suggested but instead toward the interstate, the horizon pale with first light, his mind racing with how best to move before the men watching him could adjust, and as he merged onto the empty stretch of highway he thought of Margaret's words, her desperate plea that the truth not vanish again, and he vowed silently that no matter the cost the ledger would survive even if he did not, and so he drove toward the city, to federal offices where jurisdiction stretched beyond the county lines that had protected this network for decades, and yet even as he planned his move he could not shake the sense of being followed, the black sedan in the distance never overtaking him, always lingering, and when he pulled off for gas it too idled at the far end of the lot, its windows dark, its driver never stepping out, and Harris realized he was no longer a man conducting research, he was prey under surveillance, and still he pressed on, because every page he had copied told him what was at stake, lives erased, families silenced, power consolidated with ruthless efficiency, and he could not let it continue, so by midday he found himself inside a federal building, the dull hum of fluorescent lights oddly reassuring, and when he laid the ledger on the desk of an agent whose badge bore the seal of the FBI he felt the first flicker of relief. Yet even here there was no triumph, only tension, as the agent flipped through the pages with a measured expression before asking questions that revealed just how dangerous the path ahead would be, questions about chain of custody, about corroborating witnesses, about his safety, and Harris understood that the system would not move quickly, that bureaucracy was as slow as it was meticulous, and in that slowness the men he had exposed would have time to act, to cover tracks, to retaliate. And as the agent arranged protective custody Harris almost laughed at the irony, that after years of chasing shadows he was now the one who needed guarding, and in the days that followed the tension did not ease but deepen, because word spread quickly in small towns and within a week the diner patrons were whispering not about the missing but about Harris, about the outsider who had stirred up trouble and drawn in the feds, and though some whispered with hope, others with fear, the loudest voices were filled with anger, insisting that old wounds should stay buried, that digging only brought ruin, and Harris began to see how silence had not only been enforced but chosen, how generations had learned to protect themselves by averting their eyes, and yet even in that silence he found allies, a retired deputy who handed him an envelope of photographs taken the night after the disappearances, images of tire tracks leading to the grain site that had been buried in archives, a former secretary who admitted she had typed up deeds for properties sold under coercion but had been too afraid to speak, and each new piece layered upon the ledger until the story became undeniable, and as federal prosecutors began drafting indictments, naming figures whose influence had stretched unbroken from 1976 to the present, Harris felt both vindicated and unsettled, because victory here was not clean, it was jagged, filled with compromise, for every piece of truth uncovered seemed to unleash more pain, more reminders of lives stolen without justice. And when Margaret was shown the list of names tied to the ledger her tears were not of joy but of mourning, because the proof did not bring her brother back, it only confirmed the cruelty of his erasure, and Harris realized that true crime was not a genre for audiences, it was a scar that never closed for those who lived it, and still the process ground forward, court filings sealed and unsealed, subpoenas delivered, men who had once walked freely through town squares now entering buildings through side doors to avoid cameras. And yet Harris could not let himself believe it was finished, because every late-night knock on his door, every car that lingered too long near his motel, every shadow across a window reminded him that the ledger had not only exposed crimes but threatened a culture of silence. And cultures did not die easily, they fought back, they adapted. And he feared that even as indictments loomed the network would find ways to endure, to redirect blame, to sacrifice pawns while keeping its core intact. And in those restless nights Harris wrestled with guilt, not over what he had uncovered but over what it demanded of others, the danger placed on Margaret, the fear rekindled in old witnesses, the balance between exposing truth and protecting lives, and still he pushed forward, because to retreat now would mean conceding to the same silence that had reigned since 1976, and as the first hearings approached, the courthouse filling with reporters and families clutching photographs of the long missing, Harris sat in the back row, notebook in hand, the ledger now locked in an evidence vault, watching as the names he had once read in ink were spoken aloud in a court of law, heavy and undeniable. And though he knew the fight was far from over, he also knew that for the first time in decades the silence had cracked, and through that crack light was beginning to pour, fragile but unstoppable. And as he left the courthouse that evening, the crowd buzzing with speculation and fear, he glanced toward the horizon and thought of the farmland, of the grain warehouse, of the men in the truck, and he whispered to himself that the story was no longer his alone, it belonged to all who had been silenced, and it would not be buried again.